from this computer. And also, sorry, just waiting for the technology to go. I appreciate your patience, which is a virtue. Okay, just give it 10 seconds, I think. They're saying on this screen here. I have a countdown clock going. I don't know what that's about. Okay, well, I don't know what's going on with that, but we'll just start. So the Shalah, Rabbi Yeshai Levi Horowitz, we're talking well after the Zohar, I don't know, approximately the 16th turn of the 17th century Prague, has this to say about Bina as it relates to Shavuot, the Sphira of Bina. And I'll again refer people back again and again to the mat chart of Sphira, which I'm going to open, about not just the inner life of God, but also matching our turn inward in the sort of spiritual quest. And he says the following thing. Sod Chag HaShavuot, the secret of the festival of Shavuos. So today you get a secret. It's always good to give secrets out, especially when they're being recorded live. The secret of the festival of Shavuot, Chag HaKolel HaShiva Shavuot Shem Mem Tet Yom. It's a holiday that includes 7 weeks, which are 49 days by this basic math. V'Chag Yom HaChamishim, right? And the festival of Shavuot itself is on the 50th day. Romes l'shara chamishim mishar bina kolel hamemtet sha'arim shemehem memtet panim. So he's telling us something about the evolution of bina, which I think was discussed explicitly in the teaching last time, but he gets at it in a different way. So there's this notion that people may be familiar with that bina is represented by the letter nun, and there's this notion of 49 that are 50 gates of insight in Jewish mystical tradition. This takes expression in halachic thinking in the Talmud, where it will say things like, there are 49 ways to permit and 49 ways to prohibit a particular thing, depending on the sage. So here it's 49 gates that represent 49 faces. As I've explained above in the secret of this Sphira. Hey Rishona Mishem Yud Hey Vav Hey. So this is it's also going to be helpful in the teaching we do today. This is Hey Rishona. This is the first Hey in God's 4-letter name. God is a 4-letter name, Yud Hey Vav Hey, and the Sphirot can be represented within the letters of the name. And so in this system, Yud, the first letter, would represent Chochmah. It would be a masculine letter. Someone's saying something in the chat. Oh, you want me to make the text bigger? Is that bigger?
No.
What am I raising? Apparently I can't make the text bigger. The percentage is going up, but the size is changing. I don't know what that is about. So the first Hey, so the Yud represents the Sphira of Chochmah, of wisdom. The Hey, the first Hey represents Bina. Note in this that the Yud is just a point, and so Chochmah is the flash of an idea. Call it creativity. There's a lot now about the science of creativity and the aha moment. Apparently staring at blue things and green things, Deb, you were in nature, brings creativity, but having red backgrounds or stressors entirely inhibits creativity, which is why one of the, as a physical comfort and helps creativity, as do confined non-distracting spaces. The best physically comfortable, non-distracting confined space is of course the shower, which is why everyone's best ideas and thinking, this is not a joke, there's been good studies about this, happen in the shower. It's not a weird thing, it is scientifically reasoned. So the hey is bina. The hey here, oh, what have I done? It has an opening. It's not just the letter, it's the construction of the letter. Yeah. So the hey has an opening. And the opening allows for chokhmah to enter, but also it has like different sides. So it lets things bounce around, as it were. Hamotzi'ah megala sod ot yud me'Hashem, she sod hakduma. So he says here that what happens, in the hey, from there is where the yud is expressed. God's wisdom is only expressed as it emanates through the hey, which brings the secret of the yud, as it were, which is called the Torah K'duma, the most ancient or most primordial Torah, the most primordial teaching. It's something very deep. The hey pa'amim yud ole nun. And you know what you have? You know you get this 50 gates? If you multiply the first two letters of God's name, 10 times 5, that the numerology of yud is 10, the numerology of hey is 5, multiply them and you get 50. So the fact that we're using multiplication is almost an equation style way. It's like a physical way of describing a metaphysical process whereby chokhmah emanates through binah, through a process of multiplication. And that's why we say there are 49 faces to the Torah. So why 49 and not 50? Wait, I thought we said 5 times 10 is 50, but why 49? So 49 because this is describing something that's very important. From God's perspective, it's 50. But from our perspective, the human perspective, it's 49, which is to say that there's a one about God's intuition and intuitive understanding of the universe that remains not blocked just in terms of the quantity of it, like God can understand a thing better than we can understand that thing. But there's something that God can understand that we cannot, even if God can understand each of those things better. Does that make sense? I think that's the best way I could say how I read this concept. So there's something which is hidden from any living creature, even from Moses, as the example of the perfect human who's the most prophetic. V'zeu sod mateh Moshe. This is the secret of Moshe's staff. You see, because staff, the word staff, he had a staff. This is cute. And the staff, the word for staff is mateh, which are the letters mem and tet, which are 40 and 9, 49, and hey. So he understood 49 sha'arim bivina, gates of bina, shehi hey rishona, which is the hey, the first hey of God's name. And when you join them together, what do you get? You get a staff. I don't know if I want to go on about the whole, he's going to evolve the whole name with the Sefirot in this way. But I just wanted to give this as another description of the emanation of Bina. Last week we talked about the emanation of Bina, and this is a description of the emanation of Bina using the letters of God's name, which the Zohar is going to play with this week. This idea of using the letters to emanate the Sefirot, the letters of God's name. But also it's interesting because it describes Shavuot, which is the giving of the Torah, right? And so it's a holiday of insight in some way of thinking. It's a great holiday. It's the Torah's revelation. And so even in the nature of Shavuot, there is an ambiguity between the 49 and the 50. It's a 49-day count for the Omer. Like you never count day 50 of the Omer. You know what I'm saying? I think that's what the Shla is kind of basically saying. Day 50 is Shavuot, but you don't actually count 50. You count 49 days because those are the days that are comprehensible to people in theory. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. I'll stop this share. Anyone with us? Anyone lost? Anyone have anything they want to add? But have I said something? A nod, you're here, something. Okay, great.
I have something. What you're talking about with the 49 and the 50 and sort of toggling back and forth between them. reminds me of last week when you were talking about when you and Andrew actually were talking about the polysemic quality going back and forth between, and I don't remember what the two poles were, but there were, maybe one of them was solidity and the other is fluidity or something like that. I'm sorry, I don't remember, but I remember the inherent polysemic quality. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, I recall that discussion. I think we were discussing the sort of fixed nature. Perhaps Andy can describe in more precise terms what we're talking about. I think we're talking about the sort of fixed or tangible nature of divine worship versus the intangible or mysterious natures as being sort of complementary. Is that correct?
That does ring a bell. I was struck by the thing you were just reading now. Your introduction was sort of perfect, which is it's very self-referential. So there's getting a lot of feedback. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, okay, that went away. Very self-referential, but not just the Zohar itself, like all the biblical texts. Now that they're using the name to derive the emanations, is just beautiful, right? And Shavuos is this holiday, which is something we celebrate in a concrete form, is itself a representation of the manifestations of the different sefirot, all captured in the name. And of course, names are built out of letters, and these are all representations of things which aren't linguistic. So the linguistic world is reflecting the non-linguistic world, and each piece of it's referring to every other piece of it. So it's very beautiful. It also, makes me think of conspiracy theories. So that, like, the question is, when does it go from an incredibly internally consistent thing to a conspiracy theory? Like, where's the borderline between that? Because good conspiracy theorists can also find connections between each element and everything else. And I don't mean to cast doubt on the Zohar, but it's just fascinating the way each piece is connected to and refers to every other piece. So,
in response to that, I once asked Art Green this question when he was the scholar for the Rhode Island Board of Rabbis at Congregation Beth Shalom. And he was talking very much about the Sefirot and their deep importance and meaning. But I kind of asked him, feeling like I think I know well that I don't think he believes these things are true in the revealed sense. I think he probably thinks people created them and and then recast them, backwards to lend legitimacy or as a way of interpretation. How he can feel so passionately, in that case, he was describing something which he felt was like very, very important about teachings which he feel are constructs. And he kind of replied to me and said, everything is in your language, in his a construct, but maybe in yours a conspiracy, which is to say, and I have some that I really like. So that's what he answered. And I recall being struck by how stupid my question seemed after he answered it, or naive. But I don't know if that is a response in any meaningful way. But yes, certainly an accusation against the Kabbalists has been, right, that they are, once you can add letters and combine letters and multiply letters and have backwards gematria and forwards gematria and all of these tricks, it's very easy with the almost infinite possibilities of names and numerologies and numbers to randomly derive whatever lessons you want to derive. That being said, I'm just going to throw some water on that fire and say that certainly a lot of these teachings appear in different schools such that they clearly have oral antecedents and links that were passed down over, sort of a millennia or more that become clear. And Aryeh Kaplan has traced that well in some of his books on meditation and Kabbalah. But yeah, there's also something about the sheer size of this conspiracy, if we're going to call it that, which is that the Zohar has so many volumes of such beautiful, rich teachings that at a certain point, it almost doesn't matter if they were just really good at sort of doing that. And with that, I will, once we're on this note, draw everyone's attention to the fact that just yesterday, the government did release 3 compelling videos of UFOs seen by Navy pilots between 2004 and 2015. And one of them is really a flying saucer. I think released to distract us from coronavirus response, but worthwhile in its own right. I encourage everyone to check that out. It's really cool. Okay.
Did one look like the letter Yud, another one like the letter A, another one?
It was actually emanation, yes. One was just a dot, and one was larger. Okay, so the text. Let me. But I thought that sharing the piece from the Shla lets you see how, and he is very much basing his teaching on the Zohar, how later thinkers are working with this and applying it. Should I share? Tell me how I should do this. I can share the English. I can give you a link to the Hebrew or Aramaic. I can share the Hebrew. I could read the, I don't know what people want.
English is good.
English is really helpful.
Do people prefer I just work with it in the English or work with it in the Aramaic? And maybe we'll take a vote. I haven't actually set up the voting feature, but let me start with this. Anyone who prefers actually reading the Aramaic, and if there's one person who wants me, we will do that. Really?
I mean, sometimes there's important stuff in the Aramaic and the Hebrew.
Yeah, okay, there's 2 or 3 hands. Good.
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah, so you can see the English, but to hear the Aramaic, I think is helpful.
Great. Oh, I've shared the wrong.
Barry, where are we in the Zohar? Because we can see the Aramaic in Sepharia.
Yeah, let me put the link in the chat, and I'm going to get better. I know there's a lot of logistics today. My goodness, I'll get better at this.
Well, yeah, but if we have, like I have on my tablet next to me, Sepharia. So
hold on, I'll get it in the chat. I'll get it in the chat. Okay, type message to everyone. I link you to the Zohar. That was easy. And oh, and I can toggle between them. Great. Okay. And now you can see my screen. So if you're, this is where we're up to. And for those of you who are new, this may be a little confusing because there's some preliminary stuff you may have missed, but just, it's okay. Everyone's confused anyway. That's what I can offer you. So I'll read the Hebrew. Amar Rabbi Shimon. Everyone see where we are? Al da shemaya v'cheleon b'ma itberiu dichtiv ki eresh amecha ma'aseh etzba'otecha. It talks about the moon and the stars. Uchtiv ma adir shimcha b'chol ha'aretz asher tinahotcha al hashemayim. Al hashemayim ikul desal kol b'shma. Begin devar nahore l'nahore v'slabish da b'da v'salik b'shmayla. V'yalda b'reishis bar Elohim Elohim ilah tehama lo havehachi v'lo itbinei. Okay, now I'm going to go slowly through this. Rabbi Shimon said, so the heavens and their array were created by Ma. As it is written, Ma here is an appellation for the Shekhinah. So when we say this, what we mean to say is that tangible physical things, stars, and the verse is talking about stars, the moon and the stars. But we could be talking about tables or Zoom rooms or computer chips or pretzels. Doesn't matter. It's Israeli flags, it's Yom Ha'atzmaut. It doesn't, guns, doesn't matter. All of it was created by Ma. All physical things are created at the lowest level of emanation, which is Shekhinah, sometimes called Ma. Usually a feminine, we're talking a feminine. And again, this part of God is still a part that we can't define. It's still a question, and it's the question of what, but it's the most basic question. What is this? Not why, not who, but what. Okay. Now, Then it says, Ma adir shimcha b'chol haaretz. Just see how you understand this. What? Adir shimcha b'chol haaretz. Your name throughout the earth. So instead of reading it, the verse the way we do, it's in the Kedusha, it's in the liturgy, is Ma adir shimcha b'chol haaretz. By the way, a note for those of you out there, this makes its way into the High Holidays liturgy in the Kedusha, but it wasn't always there. The earliest sources we have for it are around the time of Rashi, and it's Kabbalists that want to put it in, this verse, into the Kedusha, and they want to put it in with a whole poem about divine emanation. So the fact that we retain it, Hashem, that whole thing, Adonenu ma dir shimcha b'chol haaretz, is maybe partially responded to by this teaching and others like it. There's a couple of academic essays out there about the history of this subject, which go into more detail than anyone should want to read about this one liturgical feature. If you want, I'll send you some articles, but I'm just letting you know that that is a thing. So ma, read it as this, ma, what? God, this aspect of God, adir shimcha b'chol haaretz, your name throughout the earth. This is God as he is known on the earth. Tana hodecha al hashamayim. Your splendor is celebrated al hashamayim, above heaven. Now here's another weird feature. Above heaven is a weird phrase. Above heaven. What do we mean above heaven? Your splendor is celebrated, tana hodecha, or really kind of give you splendor, above heaven, above the heavens. What about in the heavens? Above the heavens? That's what the Zohar is bothered by. It's still like a Gemara in the sense that they're bothered by like things that when read over literally seem odd. Obviously, poetically, you understand what it's getting at, but they're reading it over literally to make a drasha, to make a learning above heaven, to attain the name. So what is heaven here? Heaven, as we talked about, the ends of heaven are ma, below, shechina, and let me just go to the chart. This always looks good in the chart. Do people see the chart when I switched? So if we're trying to figure out where in this map is heaven, so here's the upper boundary of heaven, bina, sort of going like this, keter chochma bina. Here's the boundary of heaven, the end of God's mind and the beginning of heaven. And here, ma is the, malchut is ma, is the lower boundary of heaven. And so Tiferet, which is connected to Chesed, Gevura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod Yesod, referred to as Tiferet, represented in the name, by the way, by the letter Vav, because there are 6, and the numerology of Vav is 6. So these, in God's name, the third letter, so this is heaven. You want to know where heaven is? This is like the border of heaven. This is the other border of heaven, Malchut, but all of this is heaven itself in this understanding. So when we say above heaven, what we mean to say is above Tiferet, which is Binah. In other words, Tanahutcha, give splendor above the heavens. Now what's interesting, of course, is that Hod, which is referred to here as splendor, use God's splendor above the heavens, is sort of the lowest aspect of heaven. There's Yesod, but that's just the compilation of all of the features of heaven. So it's really saying, Tanahutcha, like emanate up. It's talking about the reverse of emanation, what we might call Hitoverut dilatata, awakening from below. So give God praise from below. In other words, to say this, let's say something concrete now, because it's very esoteric. Still, God can only be praised once he emanates. And so you have this weird paradox of emanation, which is that like it's all wonderful, but it's only wonderful once the emanation occurs and there's an observer to admire it. And so it's still from our perspective. And so even though we're talking about God's emanation downward, we're still constantly like moving back up, even as we go down. And so it's like, I'm picturing xylem and phloem, since Deb was on a hike, as a sort of useful sort of feature of this sort of moving up and down at once, or Jacob's ladder. The angels, Olim v'Yordimba, went up and down. Okay, it's just homiletic. So Okay. Here we're talking about Bina now. How did it emanate? So it created what they called Nahora Lenahore, a light for its light, one enclosed in the other. And here we're talking really about 50 lights or 49 lights as mentioned before, and it attained a high name. So in the beginning, Elohim created. So Elohim above. See, here you have an interesting thing. The Torah opens, Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning of God's creating. I think that's the best grammatical translation of it. Elohim is the name used for creating. The Zohar is actually saying a kind of pun. Elohim creates, but Elohim is created. If you kind of reread it, Bereshit bara Elohim. You can read it as the beginning created Elohim. Do you see if you over literalize the beginning? This is, by the way, how this teaching is often quoted in the Zohar. The Zohar doesn't quite say it that way. That's how people say it. But if you hear people say this teaching outside the text, this is how they'll say it. The beginning created God. In other words, that God is a construct. But the Zohar is saying something much more specific. In the beginning, Elohim created, God created, Elohim above. What do we mean by Elohim above? That Bina, by emanating below, trying to figure out like how to say this. You needed the beginning to create the Elohim. In other words, the aboveness, it becomes even more terse in the Hebrew. Just go back to the
I can take a stab.
Yeah, Andy, you're good at expressing these things.
Put the pressure on. Why don't you? God only fully manifests his own essence in creating, right? So God only becomes Elohim in the act of creating. Elohim is part of part of the essence of God, right? These Sephirot are capturing what God is to the degree it's possible. So God only fully becomes God insofar as he becomes Elohim, and he only becomes Elohim in creating. So the act of creating is actually God completing his essence, or more fully completing who or what he is. So we think of, God created the world, but this is a sense in which the world in being created is what allows God to become God.
Exactly. That's what I was trying to say. Good. Thank you very much. That is really a skill. So
can I ask a question about that? Because
Bravo, Andy.
Yeah, of course, Karen.
Because I had another idea, like as a metaphor, that you only realize that the sun is shining when the sun has emanated rays that warm you up and cause you to look up and then see the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe by emanating, I guess I was thinking that, is Elohim about what Andy was saying about a sort of ontology of Elohim, or is it about our awareness of Elohim, in which case we would have to receive the emanation or perceive the emanation in order to then become aware of that which is emanating, and therefore sort of conceptualize an awareness of Elohim.
And so it's actually this very point which the Zohar moves to right now, I think. For Ma, so I think the Zohar is with you actually in this ambiguity. Ma was not so. That is Shekhinah, divine presence here, didn't exist, is not composed until these letters, Elah. This is again from the verse, who created these? Me, who created these? Elah, if you combine those letters, me and who, this was our prior teaching, you get Elohim, are drawn from above to below. And here's the big analogy that's really helpful in our understanding of the emanation of this sphere. And by the way, this is the name of the teaching in other Kabbalistic literature, when they refer to this teaching, they refer to it as the mother lends daughters her garments, though not adorning her with her adornments teaching. That's what it's called in the Kabbalistic oral tradition. So, you know when you get to a book and it's like the middle of the book and you get to like the title of the book and you're like, oh, this must be significant. So that's what's going on here. Are drawn from above to below. Now we're talking again about an emanation downward. It's overroots de le'ela, from above. And mother lends daughter her garments, though not adorning her with her adornments. So if we go to our Sphirot chart, this is probably the main unification that Kabbalists are concerned with, though there are many. Bina here is usually referred to as mother. Mother is palace, womb, but mother. In fact, the Ari, Lorianic Kabbalah, often preferred the partsuf of Bina. When Bina was being most active, it was called Aim, mom. Bina is God as divine mother. It's a face, F-A-C-E, of God. And here, Malchut is daughter. So these are the two ends of heaven. And the two ends of heaven are described here as a mother and her daughter. Now, of course, a mother and a daughter probably can look a lot alike. And one gives life to the other. And so here, God, the mother, I'm going to sound that, gives life to God, the daughter, right? God is giving life to a different version of God that we experience, but that's really the child or the daughter. And in this example, mother lends daughter her clothes, presumably from when she used to be that age, hand-me-down divine clothes, but doesn't adorn her. What does adorning her mean here? What are we talking about when we say adorn? We're talking about jewelry, and we're talking about like perfume and dresses for her wedding. For her wedding. Because what is Malchut going to do? She's going to get married and have kids, which is life, like actual life. That's what's going to happen here to kids, at least in this very, I'm going to acknowledge the heteronormativity of the teaching and the gendered nature of the teaching. Yes, acknowledging all those things, just putting it out there. But in this case, mother is lending daughter clothes, but daughter is like still a young teenager and she's not really like married yet. So the question we have to deal with is, how is daughter gonna find so this is God is kind of like lonely without a partner, disembodied, not creative. How do we get, so here Malchut is created as a kind of shell corporation in a corporate metaphor, right? But there's no funds yet, maybe. It's not like vested or it's a trust without any, it's an empty instrument of sorts. So how do we get, this is a version of the Tzimtzum question. How do we get from all this divine emanation to actual stuff? And the answer relates to holidays, which is good because today's Yom HaAtzmaut and also Shavuot is coming. So it happens to be convenient. When does she adorn her fittingly? When does the mother help the daughter get into her wedding dress? When all the males appear before her. Okay, as it is written, I should probably go back to the Hebrew text of the Zohar for a minute to read it. All your males shall appear before the sovereign Hashem. So let me just go back to my Sfaria for the moment. I don't know if I. As it says in Yeshua, Hine, I'll read the whole teaching. Hine arona brit adon kol haaretz. Kedei nafka heva ilat yud vishkash shitat b'mani dechura lekableon dechol dechar b'Yisrael. So what's happening here? Something very significant. Aliyah LaRegel, the pilgrimage for the holidays. So this is an interesting thing. Let's just make it real. What is the Zohar saying? Sometimes you need to like step back from the words and as the poet Wendell Berry likes to say, not let the text keep you from life. What is it saying? It's saying this. You know when Shekhinah is empowered? When men, in this case, come to visit God, the Shekhinah. In other words, when people engage in worship. So the radical thing is saying like God is empowered, or existence is given its full vitality. Translated in spiritual terms, existence is given its full vitality when people do their part in joining with God in creation from below. When people come to do Aliyah Laregel, to ascend the mountain and worship in the temple. And that happens when? On Pesach, on Sukkot, and on Shavuot. Now, the male part is significant. Here, the Torah only commands males in Aliyah Laregel. And in the Talmud, in Chagiga, people will know, they give reasons about the kids, and the reasons are legal about the males. But here, it's a spiritual idea that the Zohar is trying to deal with. How do you create vitality, meaning living, breathing beings? And the answer is, well, the Shekhinah, God as a creator a woman, needs mates. And so here, and Yesod, Tiferet is masculine. So this union of Tiferet, Kudsha Brichu, as they call it in the Kabbalah, Ushchinte, Tiferet and Malchut, viewed as a kind of divine intimacy internally, only happens when people from below come and visit and make that happen. So the act of human visiting the temple is like an act of matrimony to God. And that's what causes God above to really kick in. And so in a paradox, creation above can only happen when worship below happens. Of course, how can you create what's below if they're required to be part of their own emanation? And so we're creating ourselves in this model. We're empowering ourselves with full vitality. That's the sort of radical spiritual teaching here that is occurring, is that actually we are sort of a first step in the final empowerment of that vitality in the world. Okay, I'm gonna pause for a moment.
Can I make a comment, or maybe two? So
yeah.
You're right, that does support Karen's suggestion very nicely, right? It's in somehow the act of human engagement with God that God completes his essence. But at the same time, there's there's a chronological shift going on here. We were talking about like the Sefirot and God in the first moment of creation and Bereshit, and suddenly we're talking about the role that human beings, many thousands, some thousands of years later, have to play in that. And that was kind of a seamless transition, but that is a big gap, right? Unless maybe we should be interpreting this last part not as the men in this case appearing at the temple in Jerusalem, but maybe that's also symbolic and figurative in some way. So we're still up in the Sefirot, we're still up in God's mind and spelling out the different levels of emanation. These are not literally human males, but something else, right? Like the masculine part of the Godhead as opposed to the feminine part. So I'm just sort of curious about that. Do we have to read these as literally it's the human beings when they come to Jerusalem? Or is this too something that is symbolic and figurative?
Well, so Jerusalem is viewed as feminine in this case. So I think for the Zohar, it was both. And, it was both the masculine part of the Godhead is entering the feminine part of the Godhead in divine consort, as it were. But I think they very much viewed Aliyah Laregel, the notion that you would go to Jerusalem on the temple, as I'm going to marry the Shekhinah. Yeah, and by marrying the Shekhinah, I'm going to cause the divine seed to enter the womb and make the trees greener and make life fuller and really bring the final part of God's presence into the world. I think they really, I'm quite sure they viewed that not as metaphor, but as the opposite of metaphor. What's the opposite of metaphor? Like hyper real, I think. That's my intuition. Is that responsive?
Yeah, no, it's perfect, and it can work on multiple levels simultaneously. So it could be that in coming to the temple in Jerusalem, on the one hand, we're completing the act of creation, as we were saying earlier, but it could also be that that's mirroring the original act of creation in God, which had a female and male aspect coming together, to produce the world. So so it's both mirroring the heavenly thing as well as actively, allowing God to complete or manifest his essence or something like that.
Yeah, it's both mirroring, but it's also causing, which is, I think the causation is the part that's weird here. It would be one thing to symbolically reenact, this idea that we believe that God is this male part and this feminine part. When they get together and get married and have kids, things are created. That's a metaphor. It's an interesting metaphor. And that's an interesting metaphor because that's, of course, how animals and people procreate. So that's interesting because it ascribes, just in its similarity, to our procreation, divine power. But this is actually saying something even more, which is that our spiritual procreation causes fruits. In this way, this Jewish teaching could be compared and contrasted with tantric yoga teachings, I think, that relate to this sort of thing. And how, I would say, I'm not an expert, but I think the Dalai Lama's school of people all interpret those things symbolically, where there are others who really engage in like sexual acts as forms of worship. So I don't know. Okay, we'll come back.
Can I ask a question?
Well, we have Rachel and Deb. Rachel and then Deb.
No, I was just saying things I only learned about after naming my son Yoni.
Okay.
Okay, this is confusing to me in a way that, okay, I see you talking about the feminine side of God being, or the eminence being high up. And yet, when you look at creation in Genesis, in the beginning, man gets created before woman. And so it just seems like a little bit like odd.
Okay, good. So let's mirror that for a moment. So here in this teaching, actually, if we look at the order, there are sort of two versions of masculine and feminine occurring in this Sefirot. The right is masculine and the left is feminine. That's also a perception that right represents physical strength and that men are physically stronger. But so Chokhmah here is actually called father. If Bina is mother, this is father, mother. And here God the father and God the mother, as it were, Chokhmah does come first in this thing because in the Jewish sort of gendered nature of it, Chokhmah represents burst of creative idea, represented by semen in their thinking about it. They believed that like all the content was in the semen. There's no way to teach this without being explicit. But also represented more generally by the notion of just ideas and content and that being considered a masculine quality. And Binah, taking it and nurturing it, supporting it, having it grow and develop, being a perceived feminine quality. And so that's one pole of masculine feminine, as it were, in which case it makes sense in the Bereshit story, as the Zohar will interpret, for man to be created before woman, because you sort of get that. But then there's also this other dynamic to it, which is that you have kind of like Keter, Keter as beyond gender, as non-gendered, and you have Tiferet. There's this other version of this thing, which just looks at the lower Sefirot and says Tiferet is masculine and Malchut is feminine and Yesod is the phallus. And so in that version of it, instead of right, left, you have top, bottom here, and you have male, female. So there are two different male-female planes operating simultaneously in this system. Does that do anything for you, Deb?
Okay, that explains it differently. I mean, it's funny because the sides are even, and we were talking about Bina. So I guess I looked at it like that's where we were beginning. So that's the beginning. I don't know.
Yeah, so okay, so good. So the reason we're beginning with Bina is, of course, because this is considered to be the end of heaven, or the first place we can have a conceptual understanding of. In other words, God's wisdom and intelligence and those things are really beyond human comprehension. Whereas Bina is where God makes a universe, as we just described, it's where the emanation of things gets going, really. Bina is sort of the home of the notion that things are going to emanate. Even though things are emanating before, but Chokhmah goes into Bina, and that's where it really starts to multiply, to emanate. Until then, we just have the idea of emanation without actual emanation. But now we have emanation going. So this
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So as we're talking about this, I'm really struck by the significance of the human element in all of this. Like, I mean no disrespect. I love God with all my heart, and this is teaching me a new way to think about God and God's essence. But there are so many aspects of God's full emanation that relies on human behavior and human partnership. And so it's making me think about a couple things. And if this is too concrete, like, I get it.
No, make it concrete. That's fine. Yeah.
But it's making me think about the significance of the covenant in the Torah. And it's also making me think about the significance of a minion. And I'm just wondering if I don't know, am I reaching? Is there a relationship there?
Yeah, so certainly the Kabbalists would say so, yeah. With the Brit and the Torah and the covenant, we're actually going to get there right now. So this is good. It's like the absolute perfect segue. It's as if you're thinking about it, so are the authors of the Zohar. So that's always a good place to be when you're studying the Zohar, is on to their next thought before if they thought it. This one is called Sovereign. It said, behold the Ark of the Covenant, sovereign of all the earth. So here we have this notion that what does the Ark hold? It holds the Serat HaDvarim, the Ten Commandments, but it holds the Torah essentially, and the scroll maybe, and the manna. So the Ark in this metaphor represents what? Represents Shekhinah, represents Malchut, the canister of earth, and what's in it is Brit, is the covenant. And the covenant here is Yesod. So what this says is the link between God and us is the covenant. In other words, it's by engaging in a covenant, a covenantal relationship. And what is a covenant? I feel like it's a bad word, and contracts are a better word because people enter contracts all the time, but rarely enter covenants. I think everyone here has entered a contract at some point where you sign and they sign, and you have to do things and they have to do things. Usually it's a mortgage where you have to pay and they just threaten you. But people are used to contracts, yes. And so actually even the contract nature of it does express a sort of two-part thing, right? Like both sides have to give consideration. Both people are involved in this game. And so the idea here is Ark of the Covenant, stuff in the Ark. And in that metaphor, they're pointing to Joshua, saying that's another way, and a non-sexualized way, right? There are different ways of getting at this. One is through the act of actual creation, creating things artistically, musically, but in their mind sexually. But all of it being creative, mathematically, scientifically, literarily, writing a novel, coming up with a new equation, just thinking creative thoughts, but also engaging in Torah as an act of sort of fealty or deference in this case. Now we'll end with just one thing. Are people okay to stay on for like 5 more minutes or so? Okay, hopefully people are. Just go to the Hebrew text. Just because we're here. Kedei nafkat hey va'ilat yud v'it kashitat b'mani dechura lekablein dechol dechar Yisrael. So here we do a letter trick, which we've been prepared for prior. So what happens? This interesting thing happens. Hey, this is the final hey. Malchut is the final hey of the name of God. We had 2 heys, right? We had hey, we learned at the very beginning today that we could do this game. We could go Chochmah is Yud and Bina is Hey. Remember that? That's what the Shlad told us. And when we multiply them, we get 50, which are 49, which will represent the 7 weeks of Shavuot represented by the lower 7 sefirot here, and that's kind of the teaching. But there's mother-daughter resemblance going on. We learned that Bina, which is Hay, and Malchut, which are Hay, are really like mother-daughter. They bear great resemblance to each other. The God we know bears a lot of resemblance to the God above. That's an interesting description of the Zohar. The God we know bears a lot of resemblance to actual God. And some not as much. And some we have to like help her because she's our partner in a contractual or marital relationship. So this one. So we married God's daughter in this metaphor, and better treat her well. So she looks like God. She's the final Hay. But what happens when we do this right? Yud, which is all the way up here, is able to kind of emanate down. Does that make sense? Because this is where we started our emanation, with a concept, with an idea. And actually the Hay that's here is replaced by Yud, right? In other words, the emanation is complete. And what happens then is God as warrior princess in this version of it, as I don't know how Zena came into this model, but God, who was feminine in this conception, becomes like empowered and dominant in this way. And so this feminine notion of God becomes empowered. I will say at other points, the Zohar relates this to femme fatale figures in Jewish liturgy, like Deborah and others, who take 10 pegs and kill warriors and things like that. And so there's this notion of Kabbalistic Jewish gendered femininity, which is strong, powerful, even violently murderous at times. So that's part of what happens. But another part of what happens is, of course, Ma becomes replaced with a Hay, becomes replaced by me, right? Becomes replaced with a Yud. Ma, the question, we start with the question Ma, and by working up, we get me, or the question of what leads to the question who. So we deepen our question. By asking questions, we deepen our questions. So that's another way of thinking about our relationship with God. We never get answers, but we deepen our questions. We deepen our cultivation of mystery or awe through asking them in a gradual way. And actually doing that in some kind of relationship empowers God in some very big way that turns God from sort of a weak marital partner into a dominant force that's fully embodied. Then they just cite a psalm that kind of references this. So I'll read it in the Hebrew. Ba'asvan achranin mashchan Yisrael me'ela legabe aser da'el ela ezkara. So we're talking about one of the Psalms, Ela Ezkara, Dekarna befume v'shafichna dimai, Ukeden adadem le'ad beis Elohim, lemeve Elohim kegavna dilei, uvamai bekol rina v'toden hamon chogeg. This is very nice. We'll kind of end with this point, I think. This Psalm, Ela Ezkara, says, these I remember, actually became the ironic title of a famous Pute about the Crusades, about the 10 martyrs, I'm sorry. But the actual Psalm 42 is about remembering the pilgrimage to Israel, which is our subject, right? The males going to Jerusalem, to the temple on the holidays. That's the actual subject of the Psalm. So with he quotes the Psalm, with my mouth I mentioned them, in my yearning I poured out my tears, drawing forth those letters. Then I conduct them from above to the house of Elohim, to be Elohim like him. So we take Ela, we take these things and throw it up. You know, we drive upwards. We take these letters of Ela and connect them. We've got a chat going. Ah, yes. Okay, a lot of notes. I've got 5 notes. Okay, everyone's saying things to me. If you have something you want to, this is good. I'm taking in all of your notes if you're saying things. So noted. So so the Elah, which again we were described as Mi Bara Elah, who created these? These were all the things that God created in order to fully emanate. They get connected, you know, anti-golden calf sin to me, to a sense of awe and reverence and wonder and humility and all the things we discussed. With what? With joyous shouts of praise, the festive throng. That's from the psalm we're quoting. Rina v'kotoda v'hamon chogeg. So this is a good Yom HaAtzmaut teaching. Hamon chogeg. I love this expression of just too much celebration, so much celebration. It's also a good Shavuot lead, and just they translate it here as a festive throng, but I think the best translation is overboard celebration, Mardi Gras Jewish style, right? Hamon chogeg. And this represents the sort of, there's a moment of great like pride and celebration with this. So we'll just end with this teaching, also quoted in the Gemara in Megillah, Amar Rebbe Elazar. So this is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai speaking. Now Rebbe Elazar responds. Is that right? The teaching was Rabbi Shimon? Yeah. So Rabbi Elazar, his son, says the following. Shtika dili b'nam mikdasha le'elo b'nam mikdasha le'tata. B'vadai mila b'sala mishtatoka b'train. Mila b'sala mada marna v'yitarna be. Mishtoka b'shtayim mada shaktikna v'ivru v'ivnu trik almin kachada. This will be the last kind of piece. Often the Zohar ends with like a reflective piece about the reaction of the people to the teaching. That often is how it happened. So Rabbi Elazar says, my silence assembled a temple above and a temple below. Of course, the temple above is Bina, is me. The temple below is Maz. The temple in Jerusalem is what? Shechina, mother, daughter. There's this union of hey. Indeed, a word is worth 1 coin, but silence is worth 2. A word is worth 1 coin. What I said, the meaning I aroused. Silence 2. By holding my silence, 2 worlds were created, erected as one. So what do we mean by this? And maybe we'll close and let people opine. The way I understood this is a word is kind of like ma in a certain sense, or devar, or shechina, something tangible and conceptual that we speak of. We try to grasp and to understand, right? And that's part of what this midweek mysticism is about. There's a sense of wanting to understand the world we're in, to make sense of it, to order it, to know what it is we're dealing with, whether through the natural world. We move with this ma question, and that's kind of a word. And that's worth something, that's worth a coin. But silence, shtika, or that which we can't understand, or ultimately the question me, or who are unanswerable questions, are worth 2 coins. A word is worth 1 coin, what I said, meaning the meaning I aroused. What we say is valuable, but by holding our silence, by acknowledging the humility that's sort of been at the give and take of this whole teaching, we're able to give much more value. We're able to actually give value to the thing we know. We can only give value to the thing we know if it has the humility to know what we don't know. Like, I think that's part of what the teaching is saying. I could be wrong about that. If anyone wants to comment, this could also just be an aphorism. Saying something is worth something, but saying nothing is worth more. This is quoted, I think quoted in The Chosen, actually. Or maybe not The Chosen, but there's one where Chaim Potok wrote a novel where 2 people wind up in like East Asia somewhere. What one is that? You know that novel? Anyone know what novel I'm talking about? There's a Chaim Potok novel where these 2 people, one more traditional, the other wind up in East Asia, and one of them tells that person this teaching. Okay, someone will figure it out. Anyone have anything they want to say as we kind of conclude this week's teaching?
My name is Asher Lev. Is that the one?
Yeah, my name is Asher Lev. There were, I don't know if it was My Name is Asher Lev or The Gift of Asher Lev, the less known sequel. One of those. I'll close by saying, if we want to kind of summarize this teaching, there's this notion of energy and partnership and emanation and creation from above to below, but that is fully empowered by our actions here, symbolized by the covenantal relationship, a marital relationship, or in this case, celebrating the festival of Shavuot by going to the temple in Jerusalem to be with God, and that we sort of ascend up to meet, but that causes energy down. The non-theistic takeaway from it would be that everything is interconnected, including us, and what we do is integral in creating the sort of world that is full of meaning, and even shifts in our perception, which is what the Zohar is engaged in, right? Helping us shift our perception, helping us shift our glance, our understanding, our mood, how we look at it. P'tach, we started in that place of the opening of the eyes, just the active awareness of our role in the interconnected. This is the coronavirus kind of summary of the teaching, right? Our awareness of our role in an interconnected universe, not just physically, but spiritually, actually transforms the thing and makes it a much fuller and more meaningful experience to us, who are the only people experiencing it. But that is in fact what God was going for the whole time, and therefore to God. So that would be my slanted take of the last hour. I thank you all for joining this version of Midweek Mysticism. And as the Zohar said, if you leave saying, what did I just learn, or why, or who, well, a word is worth one coin, but silence too. So you can always leave with that. And thank you.
Thank you.
Shkoach.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you.
Of course, same time next week, same bet channel.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.